Good morning and welcome to Daybreak, live on A News. I'm your host, Dilek Tuna. Let's take a look at the top stories this morning. Iran-US-Israel war spreads as Iranian drones strike Gulf shipping near Dubai. Israel's parliament passes a law making the death penalty default for Palestinians convicted of deadly attacks in military courts. And the White House says US policy on Cuba is unchanged after a sanctioned Russian tanker delivers fuel. First this morning, the conflict between Iran, Israel and the United States is expanding, with new attacks now affecting areas beyond the main battlefield. A drone strike on a Kuwaiti oil tanker near Dubai highlights the growing risks across the region. As strikes continue and tensions rise, concerns are mounting over how far this escalation could go.
The conflict between Iran, Israel and the United States is escalating, with attacks now spreading beyond direct military targets. A Kuwaiti oil tanker has been hit by a drone near Dubai, triggering a fire and highlighting the widening scope of the conflict. The vessel was carrying crude oil when it was struck, causing damage and a fire on board. All crew members were reported safe and the fire has been brought under control. Debris from aerial interception also injured 4 people in Dubai as air defenses responded to incoming threats. Authorities say an Iranian drone also hit a telecommunications building in Sharjah in what appears to be part of a broader wave of attacks. Meanwhile, US and Israeli strikes continue inside Iran. Explosions have been reported in Tehran, Isfahan and Zanjan as part of ongoing coordinated operations. Reports say US forces targeted a major ammunition depot in Isfahan using bunker buster bombs. Iran has responded with missile and drone attacks, targeting US and Israeli military sites across the region. Officials say the country is acting in self-defense as attacks continue. The Israeli military says it has identified missiles launched from Iran, with air defense systems working to intercept the threat. Residents were instructed to move into protected spaces and remain there until further notice. US President Donald Trump has shared a video showing massive explosions in Iran, posting the footage without explanation on social media. At the same time, reports say Trump is prepared to wind down the war even if the Strait of Hormuz remains largely closed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the war is progressing but declined to give a timeline for when it could end. He told US media the conflict is beyond the halfway point, adding that Israeli and US forces are close to achieving key objectives. The Trump administration, however, continues to suggest a shorter timeline, saying the war could last around 4 to 6 weeks. But Tehran is rejecting those terms and says the conditions being proposed are unacceptable.
The materials that have been conveyed to us under various titles, such as the 15-point plan, mainly include very excessive, unrealistic and unreasonable demands. Our stance has been clear. Once we reach a conclusion, we will announce it in an appropriate way, because we have confidence in ourselves and we know what we want.
Iran also says it has not engaged in direct negotiations with the United States and maintains its position.
President Donald Trump is signaling further military pressure on Iran as US forces step up operations in the region. Our correspondent has more.
On Monday, President Trump announced that US forces would destroy Iran's electric generating plants, oil wells, and potentially destroy all desalination plants if Iran does not agree to completely open the Hormuz Strait for global shipping. While President Trump says that negotiations with Iran's new leaders are progressing, the U.S. military has launched fresh strikes hitting one of Iran's major underground missile silos near the city of Isfahan. Other reports in Washington suggest that President Trump may be content with ending the war on his own timetable, even if the Strait of Hormuz is not completely open for commercial traffic, as long as Iran's underground nuclear program and missile production facilities and navy are deemed to have been sufficiently destroyed. A recent report in the New York Times has new details on how U.S. and Israeli strikes are impacting Tehran's ability to coordinate military activity and organize communication among top-level commanders and government officials. Strikes are believed to be causing a significant amount of confusion within Iran's senior leadership. Thousands of U.S. troops, including elite paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, are arriving in the Middle East as Trump considers how to proceed in the war against Iran. Those forces joined about 2,500 Marines that were deployed over the weekend, expanding U.S. military presence in the region. I'm Umesh Shabander, A News, Washington.
Now let's have a look at stories making front pages this morning. The Iran-US-Israel war continues to make front pages and is once again one of the top stories on our A News webpage. We've continued to cover all the developments rigorously since strikes first began on Iran on the 28th of February, and we'll certainly continue to bring you major updates on that. And here you can see we've got the war in the Middle East. The conflict is continuing and it's continuously evolving, so we will continue to bring you the updates. So be sure to look out for our A News page. And again, here's the major story. The Iran-US-Israel conflict is escalating further with missile and drone attacks, expanded strikes on key infrastructure and growing regional fallout. At the same time, diplomatic efforts to de-escalate begin to emerge amid rising global energy and security concerns. Talks are continuing as well between the sides, but we don't know to what extent, as Iran continues to deny that there's any kind of diplomacy taking place as yet. So, as I said, continue to have a look at our A News page for more updates on that. And now our next top story is NHK World Japan. And that top story there is French President Macron arrives in Japan on Tuesday. So it's expected that he will meet top leaders in Japan, including the Emperor. And it's expected that the three leaders will talk about the latest situation in the Gulf, the war between Iran, the United States and Israel. It's expected that Macron will hold talks again on maritime security, economic cooperation and regional stability. We'll also have a professor from the University of Shizuoka joining me little later on to discuss the visit at length. So do stay with us for that, for more information. And now let's move on to our third front page. We've got The Guardian, at least 70 people killed and 30 injured in Haiti gang attack. So the latest on that, at least 70 people have been killed in this gang attack in the Artibonite region, that's according to a rights group, and thousands of people have been displaced as a result. The casualty figures are still unclear at this stage. The attack began early Sunday, and armed gangs were burning homes and forcing residents to flee. So far, we know that about 6,000 people have been displaced, 30 people were injured, while estimates, as far as we know, are much higher than that. Police say attackers had fled before security forces arrived, and the operation continues in order to try to track them down. So that was our third front page. And now we'll move on to global news, but first we'll take a short break. Three United Nations peacekeepers from Indonesia have been killed in southern Lebanon in separate incidents following a weekend of deadly violence. Two peacekeepers died on Monday after an explosion of unknown origin destroyed their vehicle near Bani Hayan. Two others were wounded. UN peacekeeping chief Jean-Pierre Lacroix condemned the attack, saying peacekeepers must never be targeted. Earlier, another Indonesian peacekeeper was killed overnight when a projectile struck near a UN position in Aceh al-Qusair. A second soldier was critically injured. Israel's parliament has passed a new law making the death penalty the default sentence for Palestinians convicted of deadly attacks in military courts. The measure fulfills a key pledge by far-right allies of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Under the law, hanging within 90 days of sentencing with no right to clemency, although courts may still impose life imprisonment instead. The legislation has drawn international criticism and comes amid heightened scrutiny of Israel over rising violence by settlers against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says the Iran war is already impacting daily life in Europe, with rising costs and increased security measures now being felt in Germany.
For weeks now, petrol and energy costs for German households and businesses have been rising. And finally, we must once again step up police protection outside synagogues and Jewish communities. If this war escalates into a major regional conflict, it could place an even greater burden on Germany and Europe, as heavy as we last experienced during the COVID pandemic or at the start of the war in Ukraine. The best outcome is for this war to come to an end as soon as possible. Once the necessary conditions are met, Germany will, of course, be ready to make its contribution to ensuring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. We have already put forward extensive proposals on this matter.
Ukraine and Bulgaria have signed a 10-year agreement, including plans for a gas corridor to support Kyiv's energy supply. The project could supply up to 10 billion cubic meters of gas to Ukraine each year. The deal also includes continued military support and joint weapons production, including drones. President Volodymyr Zelensky said the corridor could be operational by the end of the year. At least 70 people have been killed in a gang attack in Haiti's Artibonite region. That's according to a rights group, with thousands displaced and casualty figures still unclear. Around 30 people were injured, while official estimates put the death toll much lower at around 16. The attack began early Sunday with armed gangs burning homes and forcing residents to flee, displacing about 6,000 people. Police say the attackers had fled before security forces arrived, as an operation continues to track them down. Nearly 20,000 people have been killed in Haiti since 2021 due to escalating gang violence. That's according to the United Nations. And the United States is facing new questions over how far it's willing to enforce sanctions on Cuba after making a rare exception that highlights the tension between political pressure and humanitarian need.
The White House says US policy on Cuba remains unchanged after allowing a sanctioned Russian oil tanker to deliver fuel to the island. Washington says the move was made on humanitarian grounds as Cuba faces a worsening energy crisis.
But now the U.S. is letting this Russian tanker to Cuba. Is this a policy change, or is he willing to let more tankers into Cuba now?
This is not a policy change. There has not been a formal change in sanction policy. As the president said last night, we allowed this ship to reach Cuba in order to provide humanitarian needs to the Cuban people. These decisions are being made on a case-by-case basis. And as the administration has said, Cuba's non-functional economy cannot be fixed unless they undergo dramatic political and leadership change. But there has been no formal change with respect to sanction policy.
So you could expect more tankers to go to Cuba?
Again, these decisions are being made on a case-by-case basis right now.
Officials say sanctions remain in place, and the United States retains the authority to block or seize vessels that breach them. Cuba depends heavily on imported fuel to generate electricity and run transport, but supplies, especially from Venezuela, have declined. Combined with US restrictions, this has contributed to fuel shortages, blackouts, and rationing across the island. The decision follows remarks by US President Donald Trump, who indicated countries could send fuel if needed. Mexico's president says her country has the right to supply oil to Cuba for humanitarian or commercial purposes. She added that private businesses in Cuba are seeking fuel, with some approaching Mexico's state energy company. In Havana, residents say the Russian shipment offers only short-term relief. Cuba has gone months without regular deliveries, worsening power cuts and transport disruptions. Russia says the tanker delivered around 100,000 metric tons of crude oil. But without a longer-term solution, many Cubans say daily life remains uncertain as energy shortages persist.
G7 leaders say they're ready to act to stabilise energy markets as the war in Iran continues to disrupt global supply. Oil prices are rising and pressure is building around key routes like the Strait of Hormuz, with governments warning of broader economic risks.
Welcome to this day in Europe, where the G7 tries to contain a global energy shock triggered by the war in Iran. Finance ministers, energy ministers, and central bank governors from the Group of Seven say they are ready to take, quote, all necessary measures to stabilize energy markets and protect the global economy. The high-level talks held virtually come as oil prices surge and supply chains face major disruption, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz, a critical route for global energy flows. In their statement, G7 leaders stressed the need to ensure uninterrupted energy supply, warning against export restrictions that could deepen the crisis. They also signaled close coordination with the International Energy Agency, or IEA, including the potential use of strategic oil reserves if conditions worsen. While the G7 welcomed the IEA's decision on March 11th to authorize the release of 400 million barrels of oil to counter the shortfall from the Hormuz blockage, that move did not cool hot oil markets. Countries are rolling out domestic measures to shield households and businesses from rising costs, but the risks are growing. The G7 warned higher energy prices could fuel inflation and slow economic growth, with central banks reaffirming their commitment to price stability, even as the outlook becomes more uncertain. There's also a clear political message here, recognizing the importance of coordinated international action to mitigate spillovers and safeguard macroeconomic stability. Although no concrete measures were announced by the G7, including any coordinated release of oil reserves, Monday's talks set up a critical assessment today by Europe's energy ministers that could determine whether words will translate into action. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Japan for an official visit where discussions are expected to focus on maritime security, economic cooperation and broader geopolitical developments. One of the key topics likely to be addressed is the security of major shipping routes, including concerns surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. France and Japan are both major economic powers with strong interests in maintaining stability in global trade routes, particularly as geopolitical tensions continue to affect markets and supply chains. The visit also reflects ongoing diplomatic engagement between European and Asian partners as countries seek to strengthen cooperation on security challenges and economic resilience. Joining me this morning is Sejiro Takeshita, Professor at University of Shizuoka in Shizuoka City, Japan. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, President Macron's visit highlights growing cooperation between European and Asian partners. How important is this relationship in this geopolitical climate?
It's crucial. We can see this from the fact that Mr. Stammer has visited Japan in January, followed by Ms. Meloni of Italy. So obviously, all these nations are basically trying to create a coalition to reaffirm the point that they would like to have a secure distribution on the Strait of Hormuz, or maybe otherwise, basically to consolidate their, coalition, because obviously we know that China has always been a threat, a war of hegemony against the, free world nations. But the leader of free world nation is not really consolidating, the unification of the free world, as we can see. So obviously these nations have to start creating their own strong ties with each other, and this visit is definitely one of them.
And Professor, now maritime security is expected to be a key topic of discussion. Why are global shipping routes becoming such an important strategic issue?
Because it results in cost increase, massive cost increase. If we basically have to alter the way, diverse away in provision of oil, which is what is happening in Japan already, the prices will shoot up. And we are already in a state of inflationary worries. And if you look at it from the Japanese point of view, we import 99% of oil and over 94% comes from Middle East. So obviously, this problem that we're facing in Strait of Hormuz is going to hit us directly, virtually on not only on living, a livelihood of the normal people, but directly on the industries, which survives on oil right now. And our dependency on oil hasn't declined at all. It's actually increasing, especially, after the great earthquake of 2011. We used to have 30% nuclear power, but now it's zero. We're creeping up to about 7-8%, but we're still very much reliant on oil.
Okay, and Professor, so aside from the West and Japan becoming, closer and closer aligned, France and Japan are both major economic powers. What shared interests bring these two countries together at this time?
Well, particularly, at this time, definitely the Joint Coalition on Artificial Intelligence. They're already talking about making the vice minister. In Japan, vice minister bureaucrats, they're running the show. So it shows me that they are becoming very serious about the dual usage of artificial intelligence, particularly in the area of military side. This is going to involve a lot of other ministries in Japan, but the fact that they're already moving to it tells me that they are already on implementation stage. So I would say this is another next important step that we have to carefully watch.
And how does this visit reflect broader changes in international partnerships beyond traditional regional allies?
Well, actually, France and Japan is quite different from the point that, France is out loudly, criticizing Mr. Trump. And Japan, maybe they want to do that, but they can't. We have 130 U.S. bases here that's protecting us from China. So the political or geopolitical pressure is quite different. But that said, it goes back to your initial question, which is what can we do on economic structure side? And utmost important here is now to create a coalition to make sure that we have better distribution in the Strait of Hormuz one way or the other.
Okay, so as you highlighted there, Japan is a little bit more mindful of, maybe they want to, but they're mindful of openly criticizing Trump as openly as France is. But we're at a really interesting stage at the moment with the Iran war. So the Strait of Hormuz remains a central concern for global energy security. How relevant is the issue for countries such as France and Japan?
Well, France is still very much reliant on their power on the nuclear side, I believe. But, in case of Japan, like I said, we need stable power. We can't rely on alternative energy because our industries are like precision machinery or semiconductors, what have you. These industries that requires stable provision of energy, which cannot be provided by wind power or solar power. So basically, we have to rely either on nuclear or oil. And as I said, a nuclear has gone to zero in 2011 Japan from 30%. And we're creeping up to 8 as we speak. But still, we're still on the verge of regaining that, market share by the nuclear side. And it's very difficult political-wise as well to increase the ratio. So we have to continuously rely on oil. And if that provision is going to get very, very difficult with higher prices, which is already suffering from inflation, this is going to be a very bad news for the Japanese economy as a whole and politics as a whole as well.
Okay. Professor, it's always a pleasure talking to you on A News. Thank you so much for your insight this morning.
Thank you.
Now, a steep rise in fuel prices in Nigeria is pushing up the cost of daily life as businesses and households adjust to higher transport and energy expenses.
Fuel prices in Nigeria have surged sharply, driving up the cost of living and putting pressure on businesses and households across the country. In Lagos, barber Wale Johnson begins his day by switching on a fuel-powered generator essential in areas where electricity supply is unreliable. As petrol prices rose by more than 60% in March, his operating costs increased. He has raised the price of a haircut by about half to keep up.
Everybody has to pay 1.5 because of the situation in Nigeria now, and they all understand. Even though some of them are not ready to comply, but they don't have any choice. By the time we explain to them, they need to comply.
In many neighbourhoods, power shortages leave streets dimly lit, forcing homes and businesses to depend on generators. Johnson says the situation is hard to accept in an oil-producing nation. The surge follows a global oil shock linked to tensions involving Iran, with Nigeria recording one of the steepest fuel price increases among major African economies. Even with the Dangote refinery operating at full capacity, limited access to domestic crude means it still relies partly on imports. That dependence adds to costs in a deregulated market where domestic fuel prices closely follow international benchmarks. For many Nigerians, the impact is immediate. Transport fares have risen sharply, while incomes have remained largely unchanged. Experts say local refining cannot fully shield the country from global price pressures.
So they need to also import crude, and that then means it adds to the cost. Those costs we are avoiding by locally refining. You still have to pay them if you have to bring in the crude you are going to refine. I think that's one critical point. But you can then argue that many of the other countries too have to bring international crude. Like South Africa is not a producer, so they have to bring in international crude. So where is it higher?
Food costs are also rising as businesses pass on increased fuel and transport expenses. The strain is fueling frustration, with drivers and workers staging protests and calling for government support. As fuel prices continue to climb, many say meeting basic daily needs is becoming increasingly difficult.
At least 30 people have been killed after gunmen attacked a university community in central Nigeria. Several others were injured, though the full number of casualties remains unclear. Authorities say the assailants are unknown and have imposed a 48-hour curfew in the area. Officials say investigations are ongoing as security forces search for those responsible. Dozens of clowns in colourful costumes took to the streets of La Paz, protesting a new government measure they say threatens their livelihoods. Wearing red noses and wigs, performers marched through the city centre and gathered outside the Education Ministry. The protest targets a resolution requiring schools to complete 200 mandatory class days each year, while banning extracurricular activities during school hours. Clowns say school performances have long been a key source of income, and the new rules effectively shut them out. So over to a quick break now, and when we return, we'll take a look at the regional headlines, where an analyst will be joining us to dig further into some of the key stories there. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak. Now let's take a look at the stories impacting the region. Chancellor Friedrich Merz says Germany could see hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees return home over the coming years. Speaking in Berlin after talks with Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara.
Looking ahead over the next 3 years, as President Shara has expressed his hope, around 80% of Syrians currently residing in Germany are expected to return to their home country. From my perspective, I can only reiterate this. Thanks to the German people, who have been willing to take in this large number of refugees over the past few years. But the civil war is over, and now there is, in principle, the prospect of returning to their home country, Syria. We want to make that possible together.
Egypt's president is warning that the Iran conflict could send oil prices soaring to unprecedented levels, with global economic and food security risks.
I fear that targeting energy facilities, whether production sites or existing refineries, would have extremely serious repercussions on the global economy and fuel prices. Prices could surge dramatically, Some analysts and observers believe that if these facilities were disrupted, the price of a barrel of oil could exceed $200, and that's not an exaggeration.
Iran is pushing back against a set of proposals from Washington, describing them as unrealistic and lacking good faith. As tensions remain high more than a month into the conflict, lawmakers in Tehran are also considering major strategic steps. Touraj Shireliliu has more.
Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghai has said that the U.S. 15-point proposals, which were communicated to Tehran through third parties, are very radical and illogical. According to official news media, he dismissed the plan, saying talking about matters that are part of the inherent rights of Iranians is not a sign of good faith or seriousness in any diplomacy. In another development, Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, in a message to mark the 30th day of Israel-US war on Iran, ruled out Washington's proposals as a wish list. He said that U.S. is expressing its desires by announcing what it has not achieved in the war, seeking them through diplomacy. As the war entered its 31st day, 2 urgent draft bills were proposed at Iran's parliament over the weekend to be discussed at the plenary sessions. According to local news media, quoting senior Iranian MPs, the first draft suggests Tehran's withdrawal from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, referring to its provisions to do so under serious threats. And the second draft bill on shipping security in the Strait of Hormuz suggests excise of environment pollution taxes and charging service fees, while Iran has blocked transit of its adversaries' oil and gas tankers from the strategic waterway. Touraj Shireliliu from downtown Tehran, Foreign News.
A ballistic missile launched from Iran entered Turkey's airspace before being intercepted by NATO air and missile defense systems. That's according to the country's defense ministry. The missile was neutralized by assets deployed in the eastern Mediterranean. In a statement, Turkey's defense ministry said it is responding decisively to any threat and continues to closely monitor developments in the region. It added that all necessary measures are being taken to protect the country's territory and airspace. And joining me now to discuss is Mr. Melih Demirtas, former diplomat and political analyst, joining us from Ankara, Turkey. Melih, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Tuna.
Now, how does NATO's interception capability shape deterrence dynamics in regions bordering Iran?
Yes, thank you. NATO's structure, NATO's support to Turkey for many years, I think it is a known reality in our territory for keeping our balance, for keeping our security, and as our national defense ministry said, in airspace and maritime space, we have many, of course, threats from different directions. Yesterday, we have this fourth missile. It is that come from the Iranian territory, but we all know it is still so sensitive. I think all the developments, as our President Erdogan said, as also our minister said, we watch any kind of threats. And NATO just here maybe took the responsibility to protect its also bases. I think you already, the audience knows that Turkey is not the only member. I think there are many partners. There is a multilateral cooperation system. And this Eastern Mediterranean section is, of course, a very sensitive section of this region nowadays. And I think because our territory is a crossing territory for many missiles, not coming from only Iran, from the direction of north, east, also from this maybe some other countries which are maybe called in the Western Alliance, we have all, I think, all been ready for many kinds of threats, thanks to this NATO maybe support. But still, there are still, of course, some unclear points. We must always talk. Actually, Mr. President Erdogan and Pezeshkian, I think, from Iran, Iranian president, already talked this in this last, I think, third missile incident. And now I think the leaders will talk again. And I think there must be always some clarifications, especially so tensive atmosphere, maybe the atmosphere which is maybe one of the important tensions after the end of the Cold War. And we are ready, I think, to talk this with many parts, not only our Western partners, but also with Iran, with Russia, and many other actors.
Okay. And Melih, what strategic message does Azerbaijan's strong support for Turkey send to both regional partners and adversaries?
we always feel this, I mean, the support of Azerbaijan, first of all, or Turkey country brothers, I mean, because we also seen that we are in a region which is the region of crisis. I think it can be Caucasia one day, it can be, of course, Central Asian, Turkestan territory. It could be all territory, I mean, which is an intersection, as I said, between Western and Eastern important strategic zones. And I think one of the first important country which can really understand us with maybe heart, with maybe minds, with some rational or also with some sensitive senses could be, first of all, Azerbaijan. Thanks to Mr. President Aliyev's maybe declarations always with such, after such incidents happenings, we also feel this. But I think, with it, as I said, this dialogue must be maintained. We, of course, positively follows this. I mean, between Azerbaijan and Iran, this channel is always open. Although the crisis is still going on, we can feel that Mr. Pezeshkian and Mr. Aliyev can also talk and can have a real structural and constructive dialogue, as Mr. Erdogan has. So I think this support is important. But as I said, the dialogue atmosphere is also the another option, the another priority, both in Azerbaijani and Turkish foreign policies.
Mili, to what extent could incidents like this risk drawing NATO more directly into confrontation with Iran? Because it's like you said, it's the fourth time this has happened, and there's no telling whether it's the last.
I'm sorry to tell this, but in Turkish public opinion nowadays, it is also the first important point, the first important question, how we can go like this. Because we are an important NATO country, we are an important partner of NATO partnership, but on the other hand, we have another bloc, which is United States and Israel. We, of course, value this relation with our partner, I mean, United States, but that doesn't explain that Israel's, of course, this maybe 2 and 3 years important unilateral actions in a wider region. And so for the NATO relationship, I think, first of all, United States, and I think Mr. Trump in his cadre, in his bureaucrats, must draw a line where they stand. I mean, they stand, of course, in an important alliance with Israel, we know that. But of course, for NATO alliance, we must think multilaterally, Mr. Tuna. And this multilateralism also necessitates the inclusion of the other actors. I mean, the actors can be Spain, United Kingdom, France, us, I mean, Turkey. This is not only the organization of United States, and this is, of course, not the organization of Israel. This is not a member of this organization. So we can take this responsibility. We can really secure our territory, but that doesn't mean that Iran is also under a unilateral threat since the beginning of this war, and now it responds, because Iran is, of course, has a capability. We know this after this last month or 1 month, and now they really respond with ultimate force to Middle Eastern, maybe to our territory, to other of course zones. Now it is a time for dialogue, and Mr. Trump and I think United States and of course Israel must see this.
Okay, and Mili, what role can diplomatic channels play in preventing similar airspace violations from escalating into broader conflict?
I think the first response I said in your first question is the answer lies there, the direct channel between the presidents. Because as we've seen from Mr. Trump's maybe policy in this last year, I mean, for this, in his first year, he really sometimes closes all the channels for dialogue and diplomacy with many countries. I think this Turkish diplomacy does not, of course, in line with this Trump's or United States, especially foreign policy, especially in this period. So opening of channels, first of all in presidents, opening of channels with foreign ministers, I think our foreign minister and I said the other foreign ministers, of course Arakci, I mean Mr. Iranian foreign minister Arakci, they always open these channels. But diplomacy also must go ahead with a sincere act, because unless the sincere acts, unless the sincere diplomacy is not on the table, of course actors cannot trust each other. So trusting and a sincere dialogue between these actors, I mean both Iran, Turkey, United States, of course Europe, and also Russia maybe and China, they can really come to the table. And I always repeat this in many of your valuable programs. I think United Nations must not be skipped, because United Nations is the most vulnerable, I think, apparatus, organization of humanity since the end of the Second World War. I think we must not skip. We must not really dismiss or undermine the power of United Nations, unless United Nations and such multilateral bodies, we only can talk about diplomacies between 2 states, 3 states, and that doesn't, especially in such a sensitive period of humanity and history.
Indeed. Okay. Mili, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Mr. Brahim.
Now moving on to other news from the region, Japan is prioritizing oil supplies from Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan as risks grow around Middle East shipping routes. Afariza Kalimurzina has more from Almaty, Kazakhstan.
Japan is set to prioritize oil supplies from Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan for its domestic market as concerns grow over disruptions to global flows through the Strait of Hormuz. According to the Japanese newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun, this shift is tied directly to energy security. More than 90% of Japan's crude still comes from the Middle East, so any disruption there has an immediate impact. That's why attention is turning to the Caspian region. INPEX, Japan's largest oil and gas exploration and production company, is involved in major projects here, including Kashagan in Kazakhstan, producing around 430,000 barrels a day, and Azeri-Chirag Gunashli in Azerbaijan with output of about 350,000. The crude is close in quality to Middle Eastern grades, so it can be used without major changes. Until now, most of this oil was going to Europe, and now if Japanese refiners and trading houses step in, part of those spot cargoes will be redirected to Japan as a priority. But the trade-off is distance. Tankers will have to go through the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, or all the way around Africa. That means up to 55 days from Kazakhstan and up to 50 from Azerbaijan. More than double the usual route and more expensive. At the same time, Japan is also looking beyond the region, including Central Asia, South America, and the United States. For now, US oil still makes up a small share, around 3.8% of total imports. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Today marks a solemn moment in history, the March days of 1918. Events that unfolded in Baku over a century ago shaped not only Azerbaijan but the entire Caucasus region.
In March 1918, the Caucasus found itself caught in a complex web of power struggles, set against the backdrop of the crumbling Russian Empire and the turbulent rise of Bolshevism. With Russia embroiled in revolution and World War I raging across Europe, the Caucasus became a battleground of competing ideologies, ambitions, and interests. Baku, rich in oil and strategically vital, became the epicenter of violence. Bolshevik forces, driven by revolutionary zeal, exploited existing tensions among diverse communities, fueling instability. Tragically, this resulted in horrific violence, with an estimated 12,000 to 20,000 civilians perishing across ethnic and religious lines within just a few days. Historical records depict these events not simply as ethnic clashes, but rather as orchestrated outcomes of broader geopolitical maneuvering. The Bolshevik agenda was clear: use local tensions to assert control and secure the vital oil resources of Baku, which at that time produced about 7 million tons of oil annually, accounting for more than half of the global supply. Small nations and communities of the Caucasus, hoping for independence and self-determination after the fall of the Russian Empire, found themselves manipulated, caught between powerful interests far beyond their control. At the same time, the First World War created additional pressures, with major powers such as Britain and Germany also vying for influence and resources in the region. Each saw the Caucasus as a critical front in their wider strategic ambitions. Local peoples were often used as pawns, given promises only to find themselves abandoned when it no longer suited external interests. The complex interplay of imperial ambitions and revolutionary ideologies turned the region into a tragic theater of conflict. The March days were a stark example of how global interests could devastate local populations, resulting in atrocities and lasting divisions. Today, over a century later, the lessons from March 1918 remain deeply relevant. The region, home to over 15 million people today, has witnessed immense suffering yet holds enormous potential for lasting peace and cooperation. The tragedies remind us of the dangers when external powers exploit local divisions. However, today also brings hope. Opportunities for peace and regional integration are stronger than ever, especially now, with real and tangible processes underway. Recent peace negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia have marked a significant turning point. After decades of conflict over the Karabakh region, the 2020 ceasefire and subsequent diplomatic engagements have opened pathways to lasting peace. Both nations are now actively discussing border demarcation, transport links, economic cooperation, and restoring trust. The end of the Karabakh conflict presents the Caucasus with an unprecedented opportunity. Regional initiatives like the opening of transportation corridors promise enhanced connectivity, economic development, and stability not only for Azerbaijan and Armenia but for the broader region. These developments represent genuine progress towards mutual understanding and regional prosperity. Remembering the March days of 1918 isn't just about honoring the past. It's about learning its lessons and seizing the opportunity for peace. With concrete steps towards reconciliation and cooperation, the Caucasus region stands at a historic crossroads. With peace and partnership finally within reach, the challenge and the choice is here.
Thank you for watching Daybreak with me, Dilek Tuna. We'll be back later this afternoon for more news updates. Stay tuned to A News.